Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
All right, guys. Well, we are back for Friday Family Roundup. I've got my daughter, Sydney, who's up in the attic. Sydney from the attic. Hey, Sid.
Hey.
And then zooming in without video all the way from South Africa is my son, Jackson. And I think Angel's around there too. What's up, Jackson?
Hey.
Hello.
There she is. Awesome. Cool. All right. So this is where this is my 1 hour a week where I bribe my children to talk to me about whatever I want to talk about. And I've got two topics today that I want to talk to you guys about. And these are always by way of reacting to clips that are kind of making their rounds that I find interesting and that I want to get your guys' thoughts about and would love to kind of think through with you. So so a couple of weeks ago, Jordan Peterson was having a conversation with Ben Shapiro, and they had a very wide-ranging 2.5 hour conversation about lots of things. But what came up was Jordan started talking about something I've never heard him talk about before. I mean, he weaves in some of the stuff that he has shared in the past, but he started talking about grandparenting. This is a topic that I am particularly interested in at the moment. And what has happened to the impact that the lack of grandparenting and the presence of grandparenting has on parents. And so anyway, I thought it was interesting. He made some comments. I want to play these for you guys. Hopefully you'll be able to hear. I'm going to play this from my phone. This is all going to be very lo-fi, but I think you'll be able to hear it. And so I'll kind of share a few thoughts and then get your all's thoughts. All right, here we go.
Sounds good.
We see the infantilization of children and young adults and even adults themselves increasingly characterizing educational institutions, say. But maybe part of that is a consequence of the breakdown of intergenerational transmission of knowledge with regards to child rearing. Because one of the things I've noticed with my kids is that they had the model of our family for disciplining, for disciplinary practices, and they know those models. But I've watched, and it's often useful for them to have the example of the response of Tammy and I to the misbehavior of our grandchildren to bolster my children in their conviction that intervening to discipline them so that they're socially desirable is acceptable. So imagine this, Ben.
So his point just there, and he's going to go into more detail here, is that when you're a new parent, it's very difficult to have the confidence to correct your children in any way, because what do you know? You know, that you're a brand new parent. And so he's making a case, again, I've never really heard anybody make this case before, that part of what parents need is they need the presence of older grandparents who have that confidence. So he kind of plays this out here.
So the fundamental drive behind infant care is service to the infant, self-sacrificing service to the infant. And the rule is, if the infant manifests any displays of distress, that your primary moral obligation is to alleviate that. And that's 100% true for the first 8 months, let's say. Okay, so the default feminine proclivity is the amelioration of emotional distress, immediate amelioration of emotional distress. Now, that becomes problematic when there's a conflict between short-term emotional distress and long-term thriving. And you might say that the role of wisdom is to know when to step in to allow short-term emotional distress to be tolerated or even encouraged if the benefit is an incremented long-term adaptation.
So yeah, his point is that mothers are wired to meet the needs of their infants. And it's very difficult for that wiring to be overcome past its sort of useful point. You know, so it's super useful when the infant's really small, but at some point you want so you have a 3-month-old who's crying is not the same as a 3-year-old who's crying. So a 3-month-old's crying, it's like, how can I, meet this need? A 3-year-old's crying, you actually have to figure out, maybe it's a good thing they're crying. Maybe they're learning something. Like that's a very difficult thing to traverse without having intergenerational wisdom, is kind of his point.
Now, older people are wise enough to know Well, your kid wants that toy in the grocery store right now and is willing to have a fit about it. But if you give in to his tantrum and reward it, you're going to produce a child who other children can't stand because he'll play in that infantile manner whenever he's in a social circumstance. Now you can model that with new parents and say, look, here's how you.
What he said there, I think, was really critical, and that is that so much of what's happening is you are preparing your child for socialization with other people. And when you're giving in to your child, you think, well, I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing exactly what I'm wired to do, which is just give them what they want, stop the emotional pain, alleviate the emotional pain. All the while you're training them to interact with other people in a way where their aggressiveness, their emotions, their self-centeredness is the mode that gets them the most rewards, right? Like that's the problem with not making this transition properly.
Regulate the child's emotional distress. And you can say, and you want to do that so your child's well socialized so that everyone will like him or her so they can engage in productive reciprocal interactions. But I don't think you can do that with just advice. I think you have to model it.
I mean, I totally agree with that. My wife and I are very close with my parents and also with her parents. And one of the rules in the household is that, my parents discipline my kids. When my kids are doing something wrong, I actually want them to discipline my kid. By the way, I don't actually think this is relegated to grandparents. I think that elders in the community and other parents we know who have older kids, I think it's actually quite incumbent on societies. We have this weird thing in the United States, actually, that is not usual in some other societies. In other societies, when it comes to children acting up in public, for example, it's actually pretty much expected that somebody's going to discipline the kid, whether it is the parent or not the parent. You see this in a lot of other societies, and it actually makes, I think, for better child bearing and rearing, because it's considered sort of a social responsibility. If some kid is violating the rules, yeah, exactly, then there will be someone there to say the thing. In the United States, because we're very autonomous and we're very autonomy oriented, the idea is that if you say a word to my child, I'm going to be super duper angry at you and very, very upset about that. But I don't actually think that that's right. And it's certainly not true in, for example, my own religious community. If we're over at somebody's house and we're constantly interacting, obviously, with people in my immediate religious community, it's a very tight-knit community. And if we're over at somebody's house and my kid does something wrong, I want somebody to discipline my kid. And in the context of generations, I mean, what you're talking about, what basically the elderly are, is they are the living tradition. Right? In fact, in the Jewish community, you're supposed to stand up for an elderly person and a Torah scholar the same way. And when they enter the room, theoretically, you're supposed to actually stand up in respect to that person. Why? Well, because my parents have already seen the outgrowth of either doing it right or doing it wrong when I was a kid, right? I only have the immediate knowledge of how old my kids are, right? I know how to raise a 9-year-old. I don't know how to raise a 16-year-old. I don't have a 16-year-old. I know how to raise my 3-year-old to be 9. I know how to raise my 7-year-old to be 9. I don't know how to raise my 9-year-old to be 16. And so, that's where my parents really are affected, because they've done it 4 times. So they know how to raise a 9-year-old to be 16 and how not to raise a 9-year-old to be 16. And so again, the marginalization of the elderly, largely, for economic reasons, removal of the elderly from the home, for example, which again is strange because American homes have grown. We've actually, one of the great lies of modern American economics is that people are somehow living worse now than they were in 1980, which is not true. And one of the things that we have is more living room. And one of the things
he's going to talk about, intergenerational living, but I think one of the points he made there, a couple of points. Obviously, the idea of like communities disciplining is like anathema, of course, culturally today. And I think that the better point, and I think the more critical point is that there are traditions. Judaism is really good at this, of venerating wisdom, and so there's this rising in the presence of an older person. It specifically says that in the Torah, rise in the presence of the gray-haired. It says in Psalm or Proverbs 31 that her children rise up and call her blessed, to the mother of the family, the matriarch. And so the problem is that we actually live in a society that rises in the presence of the infantile. Like, we've decided that what we actually value is innocence and naivety. And that at that stage, you're at your pinnacle of wisdom. And this is really a belief that came from a philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed that in our most primitive state, either in childhood or even within primitive cultures, that humanity was at its peak. And I think Rousseau actually took over the Western world in terms of its intuitions about youth and old age. And so he sees virtually anything that is coming from the years of wisdom or society as a larger entity as being corrupted. And that the only way to return to something that's not corrupt is to go back into this state of innocence. But I think what this has done is it's caused parents in our day and age to be terrified to correct their children, and to certainly not trust their parents in this way. So I'll play just a little bit more, and then I'll love to get your guys' thoughts.
That theoretically we could do is have our parents live with us more often if our parents can't afford to live on their own. And I think that would actually be of great benefit. The lack of intergenerational dialogue is truly bad. And by the way, it's working in both directions. People who are 40 aren't having kids, and also their parents aren't with them. And so they're just kind of there. And you want to talk about prolonged adolescence. Not having kids and not having parents is the definition, I think, of prolonged adolescence.
Well, the other downside of that too is that one thing you can be certain of is that you're going to get old. And so there is really no difference. There is no difference between how we treat the elderly and how we will be treated. Like, those are the same thing. And that should give everyone pause. Really, like, that should give everyone pause.
Okay. We'll pause it there. So yeah. What any thoughts you guys have about that? Sydney, why don't you start?
Well, I will forever stand on the hill that gentle parenting is not good parenting. I first encountered this when I was in Norway, and there they have a big gentle parenting culture because hitting your child in any way is illegal. So everyone there was raised with gentle parenting, and they were like, I turned out fine, so it must be okay. And the whole time I was thinking, like, you don't know what you were like when you were 3, though. Like I don't know what they were like before they had these rationalities, and like before they were able to think for themselves and act like adults. So, and I'm just like, I don't know how to, if you can't rationalize with a 3-year-old, you have to show them in some other way that you mean business.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's very interesting, but also they don't have a huge culture of bringing in the grandparents, and so that's like double whammy. That doesn't sound like a good recipe. So yeah, but I do feel like what Ben was saying about, I don't know how to raise a 16-year-old, but my parents do. And so for my first time raising a 16-year-old, it'll be a really good idea to bring in their wisdom and all that. That sounds just very like, it seems obvious that we are wired that way, that we are created that way. That's why the grandparents should be venerated, because they've gone through all these things that we have yet to go through.
Yeah.
And why go through things newly when you could take advantage of the wisdom of the older generation? It just seems like God has given us that advantage, and so we should utilize it when we can. So that makes a lot of sense. I know that for me, when I think about like getting married and moving out and having kids, I'm just like, that is so much new all at once. And I know that I'm going to be like calling my mom every day, like, Mom, how do I do this? How do I do this? Like, it's so nice to have someone that has gone through all those things that you can take advantage of. And so, and the fact that they're willing to, you know, when grandparents reach that age, it's like the greatest joy is to invest in their children and grandchildren. So yeah, it's just like a win-win for everyone.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah, it's interesting. And I want to get Jackson and Angel, your guys' thoughts, anything that stirs up for you. One of the things that's really tough, I think, Sydney, about what's happening is that new mothers are going to the internet instead of their mothers. And sometimes that's because there is a rift between them and that generation, that maybe they can't go to their mothers, but for whatever reason, they're going to the internet, they're Googling these things, they're finding extremely new and oftentimes untested parenting philosophies that are becoming like accepted and almost like virally spread because they fit oftentimes the nervous system that Peterson was describing of the mom with an infant. But like, how do you do that to a 3-year-old or 5-year-old or whatever? So it's really almost like an entire system or philosophy of parenting with tactics and everything that violates in every way the way maybe you were raised by your parents. And then you actually see your parents as a threat to your new parenting philosophy that you discovered yesterday on the internet. So this is a constant problem, as if we didn't need more ways of tearing the generations apart. But yeah, Jackson or Angel, I'm curious if you guys, this stirs up any thoughts you guys are having, or what do you guys think about this stuff?
Yeah, well, I guess I had some thoughts. I think that the biggest thing that it kind of makes me think of is it's sort of that phrase, never meet your heroes. So it's like the concept that as soon as you meet a hero, that you've always looked up to, they are like some massive disappointment. And I think that a lot of people in like a search for identity have begun founding their identity in the ways that their parents have hurt them more than the ways that their parents have helped them, because there's more pain than aid, I would say, these days. So it don't, but if you flip that around, then suddenly your parents become your heroes a little bit, and they become the standard of respect. This is sort of what Ben Shapiro was talking about. And then when they become the standard of respect, and you're their kid, then it actually works both downstream and upstream. So you have a kid, you want the kid to behave. You give like the kid wants to behave and wants to behave well, not just for the parents, but for the grandparents. Especially because I remember being homeschooled, I behaved better for Grammy as my teacher than mom, just because it felt like there was a slightly, it's like it is a slightly more removed. This isn't my mother. But she gives off all the energy of my mother, but I know it's not her, so I'm a little more careful. It's like that sort of a thing. It's like, yeah. So when I was being it's sort of like, there is something that a child is a little more cautious around a grandparent. Like, yeah, there's several examples of that I could use, but I would say that like the child's natural instinct would be to try to sort of look up to them, and then it works upstream as well because the parents are super embarrassed if they bring their uncontrollable child in the proximity of their parents who raised them pretty well, and this is almost, and like at that point you're almost admitting like, yeah, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm also too proud to ask for help, as soon as you bring your like out of control 3-year-old to your your parents' house. And so but if the grandparents are too timid to assert themselves to that level of respect, then that is what will happen. Like there's like if I'm not afraid to honor my grandparents, I'll do whatever around them, and it won't matter. They'll be like one of my buds, just enabling me to do whatever I want. I've seen that in so many examples. And it's the same with parents, and they don't care how they raise their kids anymore now because the standard is gone. Yeah, and so and I understand, like being of this generation, I hear what a lot of the parents and grandparents have done to young kids or whatever, and some of the pain, and I understand it, and it's real. But to me, it reminds me of something you told me a long time ago, Dad, about I think his name was Assad Hussein, the leader of Syria. And it was like at a moment when I was in speech and debate that year, and I was reading all these articles about the Middle East because that was the resolution this year about aid to the Middle East, foreign aid. And there was that was the year that Assad Hussein dropped chemical bombs on his own citizens. And I just couldn't stop thinking about how horrible a person he was. And then I remember you described to me what Syria was like before there was any government, and it was like 10 times worse. And it's like, and that day I kind of started looking at things that way, and I noticed that's true. Some form of government is better than no form of government, than anarchy. And I think that we're experiencing that now through what Jordan Peterson mentioned, which is how everybody gets old. So basically, and we're at the age now that those people who are raised in the philosophy that you were talking about, Dad, Jacques Rousseau, is that what you were mentioning?
Yeah.
So those babies are old now, and it's so weird. Like they're very strange old people. Like they don't demand respect. They're real hippie. They're real like relatable, and they do things and they say things that it's just like they're trying to be young again or trying to relate too hard to the young kids, and they go viral, and it's like hilarious, and everyone likes making a spectacle of that because it's more relatable. But what that really does, the minute that those grandparents start acting like that, it literally gives everybody else permission to never have to get old, like never have to mature. It's like, look, you can be 80 and life's still a joke, and it's like, yeah, there's just and I've seen a few like viral grandparents who are like, there are some that make wholesome content. There's one guy, he was like an old dude that worked at Walmart, and this black guy became friends with him, and and found out that he was like a dirty minded old man who made dirty jokes and was okay with that, but was actually kind of a funny dude, like wasn't like creepy but like funny. And so he like partnered with them to make a lot of like racist joke content for like each other, and they got super viral as like a tag team. There was this white old man and this black young man, and as they're making ridicule of society and all that stuff. And yeah, it completely puts you like suddenly, because for whatever reason, and this is the last thing I'll say, is just that like you want to be like whatever old people, like I want to be like grandpa or papa. Like when I'm older, I would love to be like either of those two men. I think that would be amazing. And then as soon as this guy shows up, like that's all it takes for my brain to start being like, huh, maybe I would like to be like the young, relatable old man, who's still old but doesn't act my age. I don't know. So that's sort of my 2 cents. I think that grandparents should be like are the standard, and when they falter, so does standard for behavior in general.
Are you following us on Facebook and Instagram yet? Look up @FamilyTeens to get even more free content and never miss out on event announcements.
Yeah. It's interesting, like when you were describing going to, Grammy, I think that, and just feeling that energy, one of the things I wonder about why children are struggling so much with ADHD and hyperactivity is that they are not around any adults with a lot of gravity. And so I think sometimes what happens is the parents are through their philosophies that, oh, child, I can't ever exert any authority over my child. They are communicating to their child that you are the center. It's almost like you are the chosen one. You are the heaviest gravity of the family. You build the culture around whatever you want, and then their impulsive desires just fire up and become the thing that directs the entire family. Imagine how different that is from living in a multi-generational family where all of a sudden you're in the presence of your grandfather or your grandmother and you're like, you sense the gravity of like everyone's respecting them, and we all are very careful to understand that they have wisdom. And I think that a lot of times when you're raised in an environment like that, of where you're not the center of gravity, where you get to orbit other people who have lived longer and have more wisdom, that it actually calms the spirit and it causes children. I remember being in the presence of when I would go to Michigan and just be with, all of my great aunts and great uncles. It was just like something was always happening to me, almost physically, right? I could feel the gravity of being in their presence, and just like these people are older, they have way more wisdom, and they actually like me, like it was such a cool experience to be close to somebody who's definitely wielding that wisdom. And then as a child to just submit under it and understand, of course, that makes sense. But I think most children today, literally, they don't ever have that experience of being in the presence of someone where they're being, it's, where everyone is insisting that you orbit this person, not because they're more important than you metaphysically. It's because of their wisdom. Like we are honoring wisdom as opposed to an obsession or overvaluing like innocence or naivety or youth or something like that. So
I think that's another reason, another problem I have with the gentle parenting thing is because if the child does something wrong, then you have to completely stop whatever you're doing and like be willing to have a long conversation with them about why that thing was wrong and all that stuff. Like it makes them the center of like your day, and the things that you do, your activities are completely dictated by them and their behavior. And that is the gravity. Like I think that's what you were talking about. Whereas like if they realized that you were the one that was in charge and that you were the one deciding what to do and all that stuff, and if the grandparents are coming over, we're gonna like spend time with them. We're going to make sure to do what they want to do, like all that stuff. Like if they were to acknowledge that, then it would look a lot different.
yeah. And okay. So I love that topic. I got one more for you guys before we go. And let me see if I can pull it up here. All right. I think I got it. All right. I want to play a little bit of this video. I'll kind of go back and forth a little bit so that you guys can get the gist of what he's saying. So this video is about how there are political gender gaps. And I want to share this with you guys because I was really surprised by how this has shifted. I didn't know the history of how women and men really functioned politically 50 years ago, 80 years ago, and then all of a sudden it shifted. And so I was kind of surprised by the data, and then I found his explanation really interesting. So yeah, I'm excited to share this with you guys. Make sure you can hear this. All right, here we go.
That women are becoming more liberal than men. The so-called gender gap was first observed in the late 90s and early 2000s, when academics started noticing that men were no longer more left-wing than women. Yep, you heard that right. While it might be hard to believe today, until the 80s and 90s, men tended to be more left-wing than women. In the US, for example, women historically voted Republican, but started moving towards the Democrats from the 1980 election onwards. In fact, you can kind of see this in the FT graph, where the blue line starts off slightly higher than the red one. While in the UK, young women suddenly veered towards Labour at the 1992 election, while young men did the opposite. This gender gap, where men were more liberal than women, and which lasted from the end of World War II until the 80s, is known in the literature as the traditional gender gap. Conversely, the gender gap we see today, where women are more liberal than men, is known as the modern gender gap.
Okay. I'm always very interested in really trying to understand how men and women are innately wired, and then what happens to how much has ideology influenced the way that they think versus just how they're maybe innately built, right? And for whatever reason, because as long as I've lived, women have been traditionally more left-leaning or liberal than men. I kind of assumed it was almost innate that women were a little more like veered towards the left, and there's reasons for that, and that men were just inherently more towards the right. And so his point that in the data is actually the opposite, that women are more conservative, men are more liberal until recently. So I'm like, oh man, well, I did not know that. I've never heard anybody even suggest that. What's the hypothesis for that? How did that happen?
But while the modern gender gap has existed for the past 30 years or so, that piece in the FT suggests that it's widened significantly in the past few years with Gen Z. Now, because much of the data involved essentially uses party affiliation as a proxy for ideology, it's hard to say whether this is because young women are getting more liberal or young men are getting more conservative. For instance, while at first glance the graphs apparently suggest that it's mainly women getting more liberal, with the notable exception of South Korea, it could instead be argued that women have stayed the same, but conservative parties have moved right and taken young men with them, which would mean even more women voting for liberal parties, even if their politics haven't changed. Anyway, whether it's men moving right or women moving left, it's at least true to say that the gap between the two sides has widened, according to recent data. In this sense, there are now 3 gender gaps. The traditional gender gap running from World War II until about 1980, when men were more liberal than women. The modern gender gap running from 1980 until about 2020, where women were more liberal than men. And what we might describe as the Gen Z gender gap, which began a couple of years ago and refers to the fact that young women are now much more liberal than young men.
And this Gen Z gender gap is what really concerns me. Something is happening that is driving men and women apart ideologically. And so I really want to understand what's happening here.
While inferring causation is difficult here, it's plausible that this widening gender gap could have some pretty severe social consequences. For instance, some commentators have suggested that this widening political chasm could be contributing to declining marriage and fertility rates in the developed world. As South Korea's gender gap has widened, its marriage rate has declined, and it now has the widest gender gap and the lowest fertility rate in the world.
That really surprised me. So in South Korea, where this gap has, so we're headed to where they're headed ideologically, where men and women disagree fundamentally on just about everything, have very completely opposite intuitions. So where this is happening, it makes sense. Men and women are not getting married. They can't form a partnership. They are fundamentally opposed to each other ideologically.
But what actually explains this gender gap? Well, while there are obviously a whole load of factors, Research suggests that the most significant factor in the modern gender gap was actually secularization. In the 20th century, conservative parties, like Christian democratic parties in Europe, had strong links to the Catholic Church, while liberal parties were generally more atheistic. So, as women were more religious than men, and religion is a key determinant of voting behavior, perhaps unsurprisingly, women voted more conservative. While women are generally still more religious than men, the decline of religion and its strength as a determinant in voting behavior meant that women shifted left in the latter part of the 20th century. Religion might also partly explain the Gen Z gender gap. General social survey data from America suggests that in the last couple of years, young women have suddenly become less religious than young men for the first time in post-war history.
That's very interesting. I think this is getting to the crux of what I'm concerned about.
There are also clearly case-specific reasons for this too. South Korea's gender gap, for instance, seems to be closely related with the fact that South Korea is one of the most culturally conservative countries in the world, with a higher than average fraction of men saying that women shouldn't work, and one of the worst work environments for women globally. While in Europe, some of the Gen Z gender gap seems to be partly driven by contrasting views on immigration. More generally, though, commentators often point to the polarizing and radicalizing effects of social media, or the increasing salience of cultural issues like feminism and identity politics. While these explanations might be intuitively plausible to some viewers, they're hard to actually prove with data, so we're not going to go into them in too much depth. However, one related and data-driven explanation is education. Women today often spend more years in education than men, and education has become an ever more important determinant of voting behavior, especially in the US and UK, where one of the best indicators for liberal voting intention is whether or not you went to university.
Okay, we'll pause it there. All right. So he's kind of throwing out the different theses. It kind of started with secularization, and then it was continued through likely things like social media, and then ultimately it is because there is now a gap that's really widening between men and women in terms of education. Women, I think, are now 16% more likely to get a college degree than men, and that is growing quickly. That gap. So you have a gap happening in all of these areas, and this is making men and women increasingly incompatible, and it's causing women to really think about their lives very differently. And I think part of the problem too is that the more educated a woman is, the more likely she is to want to marry somebody who's less educated than she is. And so that just decreases her potential dating pool while she's also getting older, because she's has the degree and then wants to continue to use her degree and instead of maybe start a family. And so she's more likely to put off both marriage and child rearing until later. And then as she does that, that even shrinks the pool of available men even more, as those men that are her age are likely going to be a little bit more attracted to women that are younger than she is. So there's a huge problem that we're creating for women. I would say that's the biggest concern that this stirs up for me. But I think it's important to kind of just be aware this is happening. This gap is widening. Gen Z it's exploding now, and the impact it's going to have on marriage, family, fertility rates, faith, education, social media, and all of these different ideologies is so immense. So Sydney, I'm curious, I'll start with you. What are some things anything that's stirring up for you?
Well, I just feel like it was interesting that when he brought up religion, because I feel like it's really hard for me to defend my beliefs of gender roles without bringing in religion and bringing in Christianity and how God created man and woman to have different roles and things like that. Like, it's so hard to even breach that conversation without prefacing, like, this is what I believe because I'm a Christian, and then, like, therefore kind of discounting myself for anyone that might not believe in Christianity. And so it's hard to even have those conversations when people don't believe the same thing. So declining religion, I can definitely see that being a contributor. Because then men and women, or specifically women, will stop believing in their role. They'll start thinking that stop thinking that it's important, and start chasing the things that the world is telling them to chase. And yeah, I feel like what the world is telling women to chase is career, and that's how they are being told to create their worth. That's how they're being told to fill their time. that's success in their mind, is getting a degree and hustling and grinding and just becoming a boss, you know, like that's all so romanticized now. That's like very glorified. So I can see why that's happening. And in order to basically justify what they're doing, that would require them to change their worldviews. And I think that is why there's so many liberals now, like that they're justifying their actions by saying like, yeah, I did choose this and I'm not choosing to, you know, prioritize being a wife and a mother, which makes me more liberal. So, and then they go to college and get indoctrinated and all that stuff. And like, so it's a whole thing. But yeah, and now there's such a shortage of women that that are willing to go after the mother life, the wife life. So I think that's another reason why men are becoming more conservative, is like they're realizing like, oh my goodness, if I am a feminist, then that means I'm supporting women not having my kids, and like women spending a lot of time away from home. I don't think I want that. So I'm going to lean more conservative. And so there's like this separation happening where men and women are just not working together anymore. And yeah, it's just such a snowball. And yeah, I find it really interesting that women were even conservative in the first place. And so that was because I'm just so, you know, used to women being the liberal ones and vice versa. So yeah, that is very interesting to find out that it wasn't always that way, and how just the way that the world has changed, the way that Gen Z specifically is being pressured to get educations. That's yeah, that's pretty crazy to think about. And what surprised me was the number of non-religious women going up. Like that's kind of crazy. Like I feel like that is also a number that has stayed kind of consistent, is that women were always more religious than men, generally speaking. And so that's insane that is changing too. And I think it's because they're kind of being forced to choose between two lives of like, religion will tell them one thing, which is you will find the most richest life with being a wife and a mom, or what the world says, which is you will find so much personal success and personal fulfillment by getting an education and getting a job and like making money. Those two things don't really work together that well. Like maybe if like I've heard of a lot of ladies getting married and having kids, then when their kids grow up, they also get an education and like start a career. I feel like that's different. Whereas like we're telling young women these things of like right out of high school, start this career path, which will just like kind of flip-flop them. Like so now when they're young, they're going to be chasing their career instead of chasing parenthood and motherhood. So yeah, I feel like it's just so confusing for girls nowadays because they don't know these things until it's too late. They chase their career and make the money and stuff, and then all of a sudden they're lonely, and then all of a sudden they can't have kids. Like these things just kind of sneak up on them because they just followed what they thought they should follow. Like, oh, I've always wanted to be a lawyer, so I just did that. And now I'm way more smart than all of the men around me. So I'm not attracted to any of them and I don't want to date any of them, but I am still so lonely and I think I want kids, like, but I don't even know how to start because none of the men around me are smarter than me. So like it's so stacked up against young women nowadays. Like it's really not giving them any advantages. So yeah, I feel a lot for these women, but it's interesting to see where it started, and with the secularization and all that, like this is where we've ended up because of that. So that's crazy.
Yeah. It's so important to trace it back and see what happened and how did this happen, because that's the only way I know to begin to chart a course back. Like maybe there's certain things that we shouldn't have left out, like our faith, for example, and just understand the connection between because I really like what you said about these two paths and how different they are and how you sort of are forced to choose one, because it does make sense that that in a world where a woman is choosing to be a wife and a mother, all of the lessons of her faith and that the grounding that it gives her husband and her family and her children, like that would be so attractive to if the vast majority of women were planning on being a wife and a mother, especially early, and at a young age.
Mhm.
And that when you're not choosing that, and it's almost like the university is replacing the church. So yeah, that's a very different story, and it ends in a very different place. I think the trajectory is what oftentimes we're not being maybe honest enough about. Like, where does this actually end for women who choose to kind of go down this path where they're not going to be mothers potentially, maybe not even get married. So yeah, that's really interesting. Jackson, what does this stir up for you?
Yeah, so I guess for me, I think that all the literature and everything can get a little bit cloudy for me. So I just take like a huge step back to sort of look at the overall thing. So the two parties, you have the liberals and the conservatives, right? Or liberals and the Republicans. So, I mean, a different definition, I think liberal in my mind always means progressive. And Republican in my mind always, or conservative in my mind always means traditional. So you have progressive and traditional. And when you think of those two traits by themselves, if you were to say which gender is more progressive and wants progress more in the next thing and all that stuff, I would actually probably say it's men. Like traditionally, like if you were to really think about like the deep character, sort of what piggybacking off what Sydney said, if you look at the deepest possible roots in our Bibles and our religions and everything like that, we look at this, it's definitely progress. And for the women, it's definitely tradition. Like if you think about it, again, really, really hard. And I think a perfect example of this is probably the Laura Ingalls Wilder series. The last book is called The First 4 Years, and it's the first 4 years of her marriage. And she talks about when they first move in, and Almanzo, her husband, they all move in together into the house. So just her and him. And the first thing he did is he looked around at the land, and he had been farming his whole life. He was actually really good at it at that point. And everything in the land was about progress. It was about stewardship. He blocked everything off, and he had a dollar amount for every acre of land. He's like, this many acres of trees that'll be good for lumber, it equals this much money. And this many acres of oats is this much money. And he just keeps on doing all that stuff. Like he had trees, oats, barley, like tons of acres. The tornadoes came, ripped half of them up. He had to go back, and he's the one who dealt with that, all that stuff. And Laura, as soon as she walked into the house, the first thing she thought of is, how do I make this house like my house when I was growing up? Like how do I replicate, basically maintaining tradition? How do I replicate the past? Is already what she was thinking. And I think if men and women stuck to those ideologies, then what we would have is men who search for progress and women who hold on to tradition. And I think that, in my opinion, the men and women in those roles are the wisest. So I think a man acts his wisest when he is seeking progress. I think that he is wiser in seeking progress than women. And I think that women are wiser in what traditions to hold on to than men. That's just sort of my opinion. I feel like there's a gut reaction in both cases. And the example, and I think I have a pretty good example of this. So first of all, what you were saying about in the 80s. So I would say that the reason, like, so you look at World War II, that's like the grandparents of the 80s were the people that all fought in World War II. And I would say that women during the World War II period were basically the foundation of America, and the men were the bricks, like stacking on and building this incredible house. And there was just like, and there were crazy progressive advancements even during World War II. Like Hitler rose up, yes, but so did Winston Churchill. And like you had incredible geniuses creating Enigma, and then even more incredible geniuses cracking Enigma, like those sorts of things. Tons of crazy advancements that affected the world after World War II that were instituted by men. And there were similar things like that with women as well. But I think that there was I think that the reason that like the men were able to do those sorts of things is because they all had a home to come back to, somebody to fight for. and women that were holding down the fort and basically being the foundation for them to build on. If it wasn't for the women, the men wouldn't really have had but a great reason to go. It would have been more kamikaze style. Another great thing that came out of World War II is after Japan was bombed, it grew up into an incredibly thriving nation, like just economic explosion left and right, a very, very good government and justice system, and so on and so forth. Anyways, so I think that the thing that I noticed, I think, is a very strong pattern, and the thing we were talking about just a minute ago with grandparents, and it's that so the minute that everything starts to switch a little bit, so that when the men start trying to hold on to tradition more, it lacks their ability to sort of further in progress. And as women progress, they believe lies, and now they're both basically in the unwisest like positions that they could be in, and it's creating, I think, some really massive divisions and flaws. And so, but yeah, I think that like in my opinion, it's a similar thing that happened with the grandparents because women got hurt by men, so they thought the only thing, just like parents were hurt by their parents. So the only conclusion is that we should basically hold our pain as the prow of the ship that we sail, and that is the mast that we hang, that is the hill that we die on. Like that is what we live by, is the pain that we have suffered. So you disempower grandparents, you disempower men because they are both the causers of pain, and you create something different. And and I think and then you basically make a mockery of those things to try to gain power. And I think the result of that is, and by the way, a good example of that is probably the royal family. So you have this symbol of what it's like, of like a family that's supposed to stay strong, and their problems come last, the country's problems come first. And you have an American woman who shows up into this family through marriage and leaves, taking, I believe, again, this is where things start to get a little fuzzy for me, but taking, I think, the husband with her, and now they're blaming the family for all the problems, and they're making just millions, and like their publicity, they're going to be famous forever because of how much pain they've been through. I remember one of my favorite memes of all time was Oprah interviewing them, and it said, multi-billionaire talking with multi-millionaire royals in an idyllic venue about pain and suffering. It was beautiful. I was like, that is a perfect yeah. And so anyway, the royal family's failing. The symbol of family, likewise, is failing. And I think the end result of men and women switching places is what happens in the garden, is what happened in the garden in the Bible. So like the woman, the man stops being careful. He gets relaxed and lazy, and basically it's almost more traditional, like just sort of, I'm going to lay back. I'm not going to, like, if I see a pest that I think is bad or a lie that I think is wrong, I'm not really going to tend to it. I am just going to sort of chill, lay back, and tend to my business. Do what I'm familiar with. That's not really holding on to tradition, but that's kind of what men do. Like a man's version of tradition is sort of just minding his own business. So that's sort of what Adam is doing. And then a woman's version of progress is listening to the worst lie you could ever hear, and then convincing your husband to listen to the same lie. So that is like sort of like how wives were leading their husbands to Christ by being the most religious, because they knew that was what was best for their family. Now they're looking at what's best for themselves, and they're trying to find the forbidden fruit and dragging the men into that. So it's like, and so I think that example was to warn us of what's happening now, and it's literally exactly what's happening. It's just like, there in the 80s, we reached a certain level of prosperity and comfort that allowed the tables to switch, and they realized that, like I remember another example of the royal family. This is again fuzzy fact. I think Princess Diana showed up around the scene around the 80s. She is still a figurehead of feminism to this day. So you got the lane switching. You got a feminist member of the royal family. You got the lane switching in America between liberals and conservatives, and the gender gap there. I mean, like, there was a certain level of prosperity, and everything switched. And now with social media, everyone's voice feels so important. I'm pretty sure I don't know if there's like hope anymore to guard the women from experiencing lies, or for men to stop internalizing and seeping into darker caves so they never have to deal with this ever again. It's pretty much like a black hole either way, but that's sort of my perspective. I think the garden is what's happening, and I think that watching a symbol like the royal family is a perfect example of how society is sort of disintegrating. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Jackson. Yeah, both. I think that your description of kind of this symbolic, I think we really need to look at what's happening and then look at the symbols and how they're showing us in sort of high def what's happening, and I think like looking at the royal family, looking at the whole origin of the separation between men and women in the garden, and then trying to sensitize ourselves. Like this is our only way of defending ourselves from being swept up in a movement of a very shrewd enemy who knows how to lie to us in a way that sounds good and will appeal to kind of the conceit of men and the conceit of women. I think your description of the conceit of men is kind of the laziness, the passivity. The conceit of women is to get enamored with that sort of progressive idea and to pursue it and to kind of be entrapped by it. So, yeah, I think that's a reality. And so that's I kind of want to look at this. This is a really helpful conversation because I want to look at the trend, the data that he described, and then just process with you guys what could be at the root of this, and also begin to hint at what a way back could look like. So awesome, cool. Well, thank you guys for hanging with me. This is a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.